Hey, what's up? It's Dr. Taylor Krick, the host of the Autoimmune Doc podcast. On this YouTube channel, I review scientific studies from the peer-reviewed literature that talk about different underlying mechanisms involved in autoimmunity and also chronic and complex diseases in general. So today's is interesting. It's about Alzheimer's. There's tons of really cool research about Alzheimer's. What's interesting, and this paper is a good example of, a lot of it, there's no clear answers. That's what we're finding with Alzheimer's is that there's many mechanisms that are possible, and there's many different even types of Alzheimer's subtypes. And so this is an interesting paper that if you read the whole paper, it's not saying like, hey, this is a for sure thing, but they're saying, hey, there's been epidemiological studies that show that people that have higher exposure to pesticides have higher rates of Alzheimer's. And then they go through some of the possible mechanisms. How could this possibly happen? So again, it's cool. So the journal Toxics, 2020, March 2020, Neuropathological Mechanisms Associated with Pesticides in Alzheimer's Disease. So, abstract. Environmental toxicants have been implicated in neurodegenerative diseases, and pesticide exposure is a suspected environmental risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Several epidemiological analyses have affirmed a link between pesticides and incidence of sporadic Alzheimer's disease. Meanwhile, in vitro and animal models of Alzheimer's disease have shed light on some of the potential mechanisms. In this paper, a perspective on the mechanisms that could be underlying this is provided. Proposed mechanisms range from generic oxidative stress induction in neurons to more Alzheimer's disease specific processes involving amyloid beta, hyperphosphorylated tau, and they go through some of these potential mechanisms. Mechanisms that are more speculative or indirect in nature, including somatic mutation, epigenetic modulation, impairment of adult neurogenesis, and microbiota dysbiosis are also discussed. I would say that this is personal for me. These are the mechanisms that are more likely happening. They're speculative because it's early and they just don't know. But I think that some of these are probably happening in pesticide exposure. Chronic toxicity mechanisms of environmental pesticide exposure crosstalks in complex ways and could potentially be mutually enhancing, thus making the deciphering of simplistic causal relationships difficult. What that is basically saying is that this is really complex, and that it's going to be difficult to say, like, pesticides cause Alzheimer's disease. That's not what this paper's trying to say, and I think that that's where a lot of people, get into trouble when they say, like, oh, this causes that. Very rarely does anything cause something else. It may be associative, but two people could smoke cigarettes their whole life. One of them gets lung cancer, one of them lives till they're 95. So like, did the cigarettes cause the lung cancer, or was there something else? There had to be something else, or why didn't person number 2 get it, right? And so that's what they're saying is that this isn't saying for sure, but it's still speculative. Alzheimer's goes into the background. The intro is always a background on just the facts that we know here in March of 2020, the facts that we know about Alzheimer's. So amyloid beta, phosphorylated tau, matrix metalloproteinases, just different neuroinflammatory things, and it's just talking about that. So if you're curious, a lot of papers have similar introductions about the basics of Alzheimer's disease. Then epidemiological links. So epidemiological links between pesticide exposure and Alzheimer's disease has been fairly strong, particularly for occupational exposure of organophosphates in men, but not without controversy. Now, again, my personal opinion is that there's a lot of controversy because the people who use pesticides, there is a ginormous amount of profit associated with that, like big agriculture. And let's say a pesticide can come in and save a farmer, 20% of their yield that they're not going to lose to pests and things like that. Like there's a ginormous amount of money to be made from this, not only in pesticide sales and the manufacturers of those and the conflicts of interest, but just in the space. So the powers that be, they don't want there to be health risks associated with pesticide use because they want to keep using the pesticides to get higher yields. And of course it makes sense. I mean, it makes perfect sense to me. I'm not even really anti-pesticide. I just think that I'm not anti like using it for agricultural yields. I'm anti-pesticides because they damage people's health. So I am anti-pesticide. But again, I live in Illinois. So if I drive 5 miles either direction, it is pure cornfields and bean fields every direction I go. So we've got pesticides, and there are, local studies or, some smaller scale studies that show that the airborne amount of pesticides is relevant. And I measure pesticides in people and in kids, and we will see that it's high. We will see that organophosphates or glyphosate is high. So again, there is controversy to this, but there's a lot of I would say politics or money involved in it as well. But this goes through, again, just some of the studies that have been done and saying, hey, people that live in these high areas or people that work with these things, there is an association with Alzheimer's disease. And I believe that 20, 30 years from now, we'll see that more because people will be aged 20 to 30 years more. Glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, is now implicated in cancer. But that's because cancer doesn't come on when you're 70 or 80. Alzheimer's does. Cancer comes on 20 to 30 years sooner, so we're starting to see that the same populations that were using these organophosphates, that are using these pesticides and herbicides, glyphosate and herbicide, they're going to have further effects. That's my personal prediction. So anyway, these are some of the studies that are kind of showing that. Pesticides and the induction of Alzheimer's in cell culture and animal models. So of course, it is unethical to expose humans to pesticides in a lab and see if they get Alzheimer's. Unethical and impossible. Again, time being the limiting factor, and ethics. But yeah, so they're talking about some of these models, some of these mechanisms. Yeah. Then here we go into some of the mechanisms for pesticides. So here's some of the potential neuropathological mechanisms. So it goes through and it says this. Let me zoom out one and just highlight some of this. A schematic and generalized illustration of pesticide-induced Alzheimer's disease neuropathology. Pesticide inhibition of mitochondrial electron transport chain components. So it's going to slow down respiration, cellular respiration, which is going to cause a shift towards glycolysis for energy production. And first off, a glycolytic shift is a hallmark of certain cancer cells and of Alzheimer's cells that take this glycolytic shift, this metabolic shift. And it activates NADPH oxidases and produce mitochondrial and neuron-damaging reactive oxygen species. So that's why we take antioxidants. That's why we eat blueberries and strawberries and things like that, is to fight these reactive oxygen species. They damage the mitochondria and they damage the neuron. And so just FYI too, your neurons, you have about 100 billion neurons in your brain, and you have upwards of 8,000 mitochondria per neuron. So it's just an insane amount in your brain. So if those get damaged, and let's say they're 20% are damaged, well then your brain's functioning at 80%. And maybe the part that's not functioning well is memory formation and storage. That's again zooming out, kind of lay people's terms. This is a lot more specific. Damaged mitochondria and ROS could trigger neuroinflammation, not shown here for simplicity. Pesticides also activate glycogen synthase kinase, promote beta-site, I'm assuming this is amyloid plaque protein cleaving enzyme expression and amyloid beta production, while reducing amyloid beta clearance. So it increases amyloid beta formation and reduces amyloid beta clearance. So we start to see that aggregate and accumulate, and it phosphorylates tau to promote these intrafibrillary tangles, which is another key component of Alzheimer's. Some pesticides may also promote alpha-beta fibril formation. Pesticides could inhibit WNT signaling, which is impaired in Alzheimer's, and which reactivation improves Alzheimer's disease phenotype, which phenotype is like the presentation of the person in front of you. Pesticides and or general ROS, reactive oxygen species, could also cause DNA mutations and affect the expression of Alzheimer's disease-related genes via epigenetic mechanisms, meaning reactive oxygen species can turn on bad genes and that might not have been turned on otherwise. And pesticides could also inhibit hippocampal is the memory centers, hippocampal adult neurogenesis. So we know that new neurons are formed in the hippocampus, and they could be inhibited by pesticides and affect Alzheimer's disease pathology via disrupting the gut microbiome, which there's also many studies linking the gut microbiome to Alzheimer's disease and just explaining some of the potential mechanisms there. So then it goes into each of these: induction of oxidative stress and neuroinflammation, enhancement of amyloid beta and tau expression, the modification and clearance, how it slows that down. It promotes amyloidogenesis, so more production of beta amyloid. And then these are the speculative. So these are some of the more concrete mechanisms. And then 5 are some of the more speculative mechanisms, which again, 5-10 years from now will probably be a little bit more explored. DNA damage and somatic mutations. So again, it can trigger DNA damage. And that could be oncogenes, that could be turning on cancer-causing genes, that could be turning on, just all kinds of bad genes, let's say. Epigenetic mechanisms. That's actually the same thing of turning on these bad genes. So different things. DNA methylation will be impaired. Histone modification, deacetylation. Several of those mechanisms in epigenetics. And then the effect on adult neurogenesis. Pesticide exposure has been extensively linked to developmental defects and is known to affect neural stem cells and neural progenitor cells in pre- and postnatal periods. So what they're saying is that even in kids, we know that pesticides affect developmental stuff. We know that they affect the way that the brain develops. And that's neurogenesis as a child as you're learning and growing. But adult neurogenesis in the hippocampus, after neurogenesis has stopped as you grow into adulthood, it stops, but it still goes in the hippocampus. So if it stops that later in life, you're still able to hear and listen and talk and do the things that you've been able to do from childhood, but you're not able to produce and store new memories, or you lose them really, really quickly, which is typical of Alzheimer's disease. Who are you? Do I know you? Have we met before? Did I just see you? Yeah, I was just here 2 hours ago. And then dysfunction of the brain-gut axis, which again is reviewed extensively in several other videos on this channel. But brain health is influenced by the health of the gut, and more specifically the gut microbiome. There's a two-way involvement. The vagus nerve is involved. Tryptophan metabolism, short-chain fatty acid. There are a lot of different mechanisms here. But again, gut microbiota dysbiosis is known to occur in Alzheimer's disease, and its induction could aggravate disease progression in Alzheimer's models. So, then that's the end. My point with this paper is just that, I think that you still might hear people say the pesticides don't have any association with Alzheimer's disease. They absolutely do. I'm not saying they cause them. Cause is hard to nail down again. But do they contribute to them? Yes, absolutely. And this explains some of the potential mechanisms. The epidemiological studies show that it's happening, but absolutely I believe that they play a role. And so on my podcast, again, we talk about toxins, and we talk about pesticides, and we talk about mercury, and we talk about glyphosate, we talk about mold, and whatever the case may be. And this isn't the only toxin that you need to care about. So my takeaway isn't hey, go watch out for pesticides. But absolutely, this is a reason to buy organic food. Absolutely, this is a reason to, if you live in the Midwest, have an air purifier, or just be aware of these things, because they are a drop in the bucket, and that bucket will fill. And it has many sources that are filling it. So it's not like pesticides were the one hose that fills your metaphorical bucket, but they're absolutely one of the hoses that could be filling your bucket if you're exposed to them, and it can lead to different problems down the road, such as Alzheimer's disease. So, hope that's helpful.